Good afternoon, and welcome to the Huxley Speaker Series. Those of you who have internet access, I guess I'm speaking to the choir. Many of us have had challenges today. My name is Stefan Freeland. I'm the coordinator of the series this quarter, and today it is my pleasure to introduce our guests, Mendel Skulski and Adam Huggins. The pair are the founders of the Future Ecologies podcast, essentially an online radio show, where they weave together stories and science and music. If you haven't checked it out already, I encourage you to find the Future Ecologies podcast and download that. And there's a link, of course, on our webpage. We'll have time for questions at the end. You can submit those via chat. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Adam and Mendel. Welcome. Thank you.
Hi, can you see me? Hey, hi everybody. Thank you so much to Stefan and to Huxley and Western Washington University for having us. It's a huge honor to be here. A few of you may have already heard our show, but as Stefan mentioned, it's a podcast, and if you're not familiar, it's basically a radio show you can make in your bedroom like this. And we've been doing it for just about 2.5 years now. I mean, we've been working on it for just over 3 years, but we launched back in the middle of 2018. I'm coming to you from the Vancouver, Canada. Adam is on Galiano Island. I'm here on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And Adam on the Gulf Coast is on the unceded territories of the Wasanich, Penelakut, Huluitsum, Lalem Sarataneo, and other Hulkamanum speaking peoples. If you know the show, you might be surprised to hear how much we stutter and pause and use filler words, because we cut all that out and we have lots of opportunity to say things over again. So this is new for us. I'm also, we're used to not seeing our audience. It's a little weird to just be speaking into the void, but yeah. One thing maybe about the show, we have been making the show about nature for several years, but it might be surprising to you to learn that we never really felt like we had the capacity to talk about climate change, which is clearly something that's central to talking about the environment, because we tend to focus on these stories that are much more dialed in and that we can talk about in it. We just didn't have a framework to really be able to capture that in a single episode. So between our second and third season, we embarked on a project with the support of the University of Victoria called Scales of Change, where we were introduced to a body of work and given this opportunity to sort of interpret it and storify it and create an audio artwork around it. And we were really grateful to sort of discover this new language with which to perceive the idea about what is holding us back as a society from really taking action on climate change. And that was our series, Scales of Change, which came out over this past spring and summer. So Adam, maybe I'll hand it over to you to introduce that series.
Thanks, Mendel, and hello, everybody. My name is Adam. Again, thanks so much for having us. I'm really excited to talk to you today about Scales of Change. The reason that we decided to focus specifically on this series that we did last summer is because it was a bit of a challenge for us. As Mendel said, the climate crisis is a sprawling, decadal, global issue. And the stories that we've been trying to tell are often nuanced, local stories. And it's just very, I think it's challenging to talk about this issue sometimes. For a lot of us, even those of us who deeply care about it. And so, at a certain point, we realized that we just had to start talking about it more directly. And this series gave us the opportunity to do so. So I'm gonna actually share my screen here for a second and bring you inside Scales of Change with us. There we are. All right, so Scales of Change. The series is based around the work of Dr. Robert Gifford, who is based out of the University of Victoria. He is an elder statesman at the university and a psychology professor. And one of his kind of life's work has been to assemble a collection of what he calls dragons, the dragons of inaction. And the dragons of inaction are it's a sort of cryptozoological taxonomy of the various psychological reasons why those of us who know that climate change is real and care about it still often do not do everything that we think we should do or could potentially do. So it's essentially a classification system for psychological barriers that we encounter when we try to do something about climate change. And we thought this was kind of, I mean, we're both nature nerds, we're naturalists, we love taxonomy. And so we were delighted by this idea of a taxonomy of dragons grouped into a number of genera or genuses, groups that are based off of a biological taxonomy system, but for psychological concepts. And it gave us a wonderful frame with which to, oh yeah, right, there's the taxonomy. And because we're really nerds, Robert never did this, but we gave them Latin names to go along with the sort of biological taxonomy thing that we were doing with them. So there's the taxonomy of the dragons. We were trying to essentially approach the issue of climate change through this lens. And this particular lens opened up a lot of possibilities. We could go through and look at different aspects of the climate crisis through the lens of all the things that are holding us back from addressing various aspects of it. It also posed a couple of different challenges for us. One of them right off the bat was it really opened up this question of individual versus collective action. And anyone who spent a lot of time talking or thinking about climate change has, of course, encountered this question of, well, is the only action that's meaningful collective action at a societal scale, especially given that we know that it's just a handful of corporations and, frankly, nations, right, in wealthier nations in the more developed world that are responsible for the vast majority of the issues related to climate change. And at the same time, is individual action even meaningful at all, given the scale of the issue? And on the flip side, the risk that by focusing on psychology, we would be sort of individualizing the issue, right? Focusing too much on the individual actions that we could take and not enough on the structural barriers that we face. So that was an issue that we knew we needed to address right off the bat in taking this project on. The other issue was the issue of kind of audience. Who were we trying to reach? And as a podcaster, you don't have a lot of control over that. People find your podcast in a lot of different ways, and we're always amazed. We have listeners literally all around the world. Apparently, we're pretty big in Estonia, which I don't know how that happened. So the audience kind of chooses you in this case, but we were trying to figure out, well, who are we trying to reach with this, and what are we trying to tell them? And there's that kind of issue of the risk of preaching to the choir, right? Of just having the same kinds of conversations among like-minded people and not really reaching beyond that window or bringing anything new into the discussion. And so those were our concerns right off the bat. And I'm going to play a clip to you from the beginning of the series that kind of speaks to that. And we'll set the stage for the rest of this talk. So hopefully this works.
The climate crisis is the defining challenge of our lifetimes, a complete existential threat to countless lives on this planet. It colors every topic, every single conversation we have, every waking hour. But what else is there to say about it that hasn't already been written on thousands of cardboard signs, scholarly articles, or intergovernmental reports?
And yet, here we are, trying to explore different ways of seeing this world that we share, and radically different ways of inhabiting it. Within the climate crisis, there's just so much that we could be doing at a personal level, a political level, and even through this very platform. So much that we feel we should be doing. And we're pretty sure that, at least at times, you feel this way as well.
Or basically all the time.
And you're definitely not alone. Still, we're struggling to square that anxiety, this feeling that you and I and we just aren't doing enough, with the reality that our individual efforts are mathematically meaningless in the face of this crisis of planetary proportions. And all the while, governments and vested interests, disaster capitalists, they've tried to offload the blame on us as individuals, our consumption habits, saying that if we're just less needy, or if we were a little less greedy,
less human,
then we could make the difference with our individual choices, even as they try to sell us more stuff and keep growing the economy. In this frame, we only register as consumers. At the same time, many activists and theorists, radical thinkers of all stripes, completely dismiss this individualizing logic in favor of a class-based or an ecological ideology, arguing that only mass movements and revolutionary structural overhaul under intense political pressure, accompanied by this global cultural shift to an ecological worldview, only that's going to get the job done. And in this frame, we only matter insofar as we can be political or cultural agents. Neither of these theories of change feel quite right to us. And so we've been focusing on stories that feel more tangible, more comprehensible.
But whenever we sit down to press record, whatever the topic of the day may be, there's always the specter of climate change, threatening to engulf the entire story. So we've just avoided it, relegated it to the endnotes. We just didn't have a framework to break it down into manageable pieces.
That is, until we met Robert.
Oh, I'm glad to meet you. Glad to be here.
Okay. So yeah, that's really where we started off the whole series, with this introduction chapter. And the following 7 episodes were broken down into those individual genera of the broad categories of dragons. And within those, we would treat just 1 or 2 species, because after all, there are close to 40 at this point, and it takes a long time to just say all their names, let alone go into any amount of detail. So we really tried to pick a few that we thought would be the most impactful. And one of our key strategies here, as you may have noticed, these are the dragons of inaction. These are the things that are holding us back, and it's not particularly empowering to talk just about what those are and all these problems that we have. So at every moment, we were looking for ways that we could identify people or strategies that are overcoming the dragons and actually changing that psychology, or even better, flipping that psychology on its head and applying those same, maybe more fundamental things about what it means to be a human in a society, and applying those for positive climate change. So, or rather positive behavior change in changing climate. So one of the most fundamental things there is just the first step of believing that we can change, and that the impacts of our changes even matter. So the first dragons that we dealt with were a pair of perceived behavioral control and perceived self-efficacy. And to address those, it really comes down to hope. And it's not a kind of blind hope that everything will be okay. That's an optimism bias that is another kind of dragon in and of itself, that, you know, you can just take your hands off the wheel and things will work themselves out. This was a kind of hope, and the idea was introduced to us by our guest, Ellen Kelsey, and it's a sort of a theory of storytelling that exists out in the world, given this name Hope Punk by Alexandra Rowland. And it's this idea that even though you might find yourselves in a pretty grim situation, that if you very intentionally seek to make it better and make whatever you have at hand as good as it possibly can be, that you will always be improving your situation. And that really guided, that really set the tone for the series as a whole, and gave us a lot to think about. So this was a little bit of that conversation with Ellen Kelsey.
Yeah, so bright spots, in fact, I think it's a term that I first came upon it in the humanitarian world. Foreign aid workers, for example, or those who are working in highly impoverished areas would look at where are places doing better than they should have. Like, rather than looking and saying, we know that hunger or malnutrition is a huge problem in this area, you would know that that's the case and understand the broad societal issues that are contributing to that. At the same time, you might say, but where are the places where people are actually healthier than they should be compared to other people? What are they doing? What are they doing differently? So by studying bright spots, you have the capacity to see what enhances something rather than to continuously look at what's contributing to its demise.
And yeah, Ellen doesn't actually mention Hope Puck in that particular clip, but it's the frame that she's looking at these issues through. And this idea of bright spots was something that we felt was a great counter to the dragon of perceived self-efficacy, because, you know, these bright spots, these areas where things are going better than they should be, or better than they are in surrounding areas, or you know, particular projects or people who are really driving change, they counter the notion that we don't have or can't have any effect on a large issue like the climate crisis. And so we use this idea of bright spots throughout the series. We were actually just consistently learning from the people that we talked to and trying to employ their ideas in the construction of the media that we were trying to communicate through. And so, you know, in other episodes, for example, the one on technology and the dragons of techno salvation, which is, you know, basically the idea that technology is going to evolve rapidly enough to save us and that we don't have to do anything else. Of course, we know that that's not true, although that is the kind of thinking that I think keeps many of us from acting at various points. But at the same time, you know, there are bright spots where, for example, with carbon capture and storage technology, things are evolving really rapidly, and we're probably going to need some of those technologies. And so instead of just focusing on how technology cannot save us, we decided to talk about how, of course, you know, we know that it can't save us, and it's foolish to think that it can on its own. But there are certain areas where, thankfully, things are evolving really well, and we're going to be able to employ those technologies in ways that may become very necessary alongside the other changes that we're going through. So that's an example of focusing on bright spots. Another thing that we tried to do was to bring some nuance to some of these dragons, where, you know, in certain cases there are exceptions, if you will. One example of this is the dragon of place attachment. And this is another dragon that's sort of a common sense notion that those of us who, for or whatever reason, are you know, just passing through places, or who are quite mobile in our lives, don't get attached to any particular place. And so maybe because of that, we don't care as much for the places that we live in, don't have that feeling of stewardship, and maybe we'll do less for the environment or less about climate change because of that. Whereas those of us who are really deeply embedded in place are going to, of course, care for our places and do something on climate change. So that's kind of how the dragon is typically thought of, and that's how Robert describes it. But we also spoke with a subject matter expert named Dr. Layla Scannell, who's one of Robert's students. And, you know, she affirmed that, yes, indeed, that's something that happens. But she has also done some work that suggests that place attachment can be a bit of a double-edged sword. And so I'm going to play this clip from one of our later episodes that delves into that.
Layla's research has dug deep into the effects of place attachment on climate action. And her results show that there is a positive relationship between place attachment and caring about the climate. But it really depends on what we mean when we say place.
So I looked at two communities in BC, Nelson and Trail in the Kootenays. And in both communities, being attached to the natural environment is associated with more pro-environmental action. But only in one community, being attached to the civic aspects of that community is associated with more pro-environmental behavior. And that is being attached to Nelson, which is just, it espouses environmental values in terms of its identity. And in trail, they have different goals and different things that they're focusing on, but it's industry, it's lifestyle, it's sports. And so, you can be very attached to both places, but it has a different outcome in terms of environmental behavior.
This is where place attachment collides with worldviews to produce a major barrier to positive environmental change.
So there's two dragons there, I guess. There's the one that the disassociation one, however you frame that, and then the other dragon is one that it's kind of like it's a defensive dragon. It's like don't touch my dragon cave. This is how I want it the way it is. Don't change anything. So they're different. I think they're different dragons.
I believe we've just witnessed the hatching of a new dragon.
So we had a little fun discovering this new dragon, because part of Robert's theory here, and he would be the last person to claim that he has discovered all of these different psychological elements that make up barriers to climate change. He's quite enthusiastic about people submitting new ones to him and seeing what remains out there in the world. And so as Layla said, that there's really two different kinds of place attachment dragons. One is this lack of place attachment, and the other a kind of place attachment that's embedded with cultural values that don't line up with positive environmental behavior. And so this was just a fun exercise for us to get into a little bit of the weeds of science communication, because Layla is one of the foremost authors on the topic of place attachment. So we were really trying to do our best to communicate the science, communicate the psychologies that Robert was laying out, and at the same time giving people tools to activate new ways of thinking and new ways of talking to their communities. Especially, I think a lot of what our work comes down to is trying to create the seed for community conversations, rather than just telling people how it is and how it should be. All of these things are these fluid values that come out of discussion and are formed together. I'll hand it back to you, Adam.
Sure. Yeah. It's a desire to certainly like provoke thought and questions rather than to program answers. I think taking that a little bit further. So another thing that we tried to address is that sometimes when the dragons are articulated, there's sort of a North American centricity to them. A lot of the examples that are used for, trying to give an example center around maybe the adoption of electric vehicles or whether we ride our bikes or not. These kinds of pro-environmental behaviors that are, things that we wrestle with in the sort of developed world. And so there's this one of the dragons is physical risk, and usually the example that is given is, well, many of us are afraid to ride our bicycles because we're afraid of being injured or falling over. And so that physical risk discourages us from doing something that we know is a pro-climate behavior, which is riding our bikes instead of driving ever larger and more armored vehicles to protect ourselves from one another. That's definitely a thing. It's an important thing. It's a thing that many of us deal with. It's also, as an example of physical risk dissuading action on the climate, I would say, what do they call it? First world problems. So we wanted to broaden that by bringing in, the questions that many environmental activists, including in Canada and North America, but also throughout the world, face in terms of intense political and physical violence against their persons and their families for the stands that they're taking to defend their communities, to defend their land and water. And so we reached out to a journalist friend of ours named Sarah Sachs, who has spent a lot of time in the Ecuadorian Amazon and was able to bring us a story of a woman named Gloria Ushigua, a story that's been told in other media, but I think we were able to tell in a context that was different and that really focused on Gloria's just incredible ability to look physical risk straight in the face, and I mean, basically laugh it off. Like she faced intense physical risk, and family members of hers, and she overcame it to do some pretty incredible things with regards to preventing oil extraction in her territories. And so I'm going to play you a clip from that episode featuring Sarah and Gloria.
Ecuador had just given the contract for the oil to China, and Gloria got wind that there was a plan to send a group of engineers and seismologists into her territory. And Gloria has friends in Shell, so she casually asks when the exploration team is planning to take off.
¿Y cuándo van a entrar? Yo pregunté.
I asked, when are they going to go?
Me dijeron, mañana.
They told me tomorrow.
¿Qué hora? Las 10.
What time? 10 o'clock.
Le compramos fósforo, vela.
Then we bought matches and a torch.
And then, with a group of 5 other women, she hides down the runway.
Porque el avión prende nomás.
Because the plane was leaving soon.
It's important to note that these planes are really small. They're like 5-seater Cessnas. They're tiny. You have to weigh yourself and everything you're taking on beforehand, and you have to calculate the exact amount of gas you need, and you can't mess it up. Otherwise, you were just stranded.
Y después ya metieron todo.
They started loading everything in, and we got closer. So we were hidden below the plane.
And as the plane is about to start going down the runway, Gloria and these women run up to it with these burning torches and stop the plane from taking off.
El boom, ya el avión ya estaba para salir, pues.
Just as it was about to take off,
Boom, le entramos.
boom, we entered.
No tenía puerta.
It had no door.
Boom, le entramos con fósforo.
We jumped inside with the torches.
Capitán, que yo le dije, cállate vos, no es tu territorio, le dije para aterrizar allá.
I said to the captain, shut up. This is not your territory.
No es tuyo, yo voy a prender ya.
Turn it off. Now.
So this was probably the most exciting moment in the whole series, the most active, I think. And Gloria's story of overcoming physical risk is maybe not one that many people would find precisely relevant to their daily lives in terms of like literally putting their lives at risk for their community and their local environment. But the key lessons that I thought we were trying to bring from this is that Gloria herself has a really kind of selective memory for risk, that she has a lot of fun in these kind of hairy situations, and she almost chooses to remember the joy and the solidarity that comes from those moments. And that's, I think, personally really inspiring and something that we can take into these climate battles in our own life. And at its core, that was kind of the thesis of the whole series. And if you, how we approached this and zooming out from the thing itself is really a meta narrative about this idea of storytelling and the different ways that climate change and climate positive behaviors are communicated in the media, and again, communicated internally in our own monologues and within our communities, that if we recognize these things as narratives for one and flexible, that we have an opportunity to imagine positive change and recognize our own capacity to fulfill that rather than just wallowing in this doom scenario. So yeah, that was our goal to impart.
And we hope that we achieved it. I guess you can judge listening to this series what you take away from it. You know, for ourselves, the two questions that we brought up at the very beginning of this talk, which were questions of audience and of scale. I think in the process of interviewing people and putting this series together, at least for ourselves, we answered these questions in some respect. The question of audience of the risk of speaking or preaching to the choir. You know, I think we decided that we weren't gonna be necessarily with our podcast reaching out to people who are just, you know, climate denialists or who don't have any of this on their radar, but that it's actually really important for those of us who do want to do something about it, we're all affected by these dragons. Mendel and I and everybody else who we spoke to, and everybody, you know, we all confront these barriers all the time in our lives. And many times we overcome them and sometimes we don't. And we need to talk to each other about this. We need to just continually talk and mutually reinforce and have these conversations with one another. And so we're not so much, I think, preaching to the choir when we do this. We are, in some senses, preaching to the congregation. We're speaking with the people who've shown up for this conversation, and trying to share some good stories, and maybe problematize some of our thinking and shift the way that we think about and talk about these issues in the process. And so,
and maybe the dragons themselves can be a useful device to communicate specific things that you see in yourself and in your neighborhood. So it was fun to share that language.
And then the question of scale, of, you know, how do we scale this kind of change up, or is the scale, like, is small scale change meaningful? I think in the end, after all of our conversations, you know, we came to the conclusion that you know, every little thing in this series, you know, we have a woman standing up to defend her entire territory against oil exploitation, and we have a group of people in Victoria who found a house that was going to be demolished and turned it into a climate change haunted house called the Wasteland for a few weeks. And I found both of those stories really meaningful personally, and enjoyed learning more and exploring them. And I think that, you know, any change at any scale is significant, whether it's at an enormous scale or whether it's just at the scale of our own thinking and the stories we tell ourselves, our own psychology. And, you know, I think that's one of the takeaways from this series for me anyway. And just to take you away, and to end this talk, we have a clip of Quatstanat Charlene George, who is an artist that we interviewed for one of our early episodes. And I think who sums things up quite nicely. Thank you so much for your time and for listening to us. I hope that you listen to the series and you know, learn something from us just talking through how we thought about producing it and what we were hoping to do. And hopefully we were able to achieve it to some extent. So here's Quatstanat.
Because we have a very beautiful opportunity to embrace change. And if we look at the gifts that all the different beings have, we have such a wealth of answers that we could look at for how to guide us. So not only do we have responsibilities and gifts, but we could look at them as we have tasks to overcome. And so my cousin always uses the analogy of dragons. Yeah, you got to slay those dragons, honey, because those are what's holding you back. So it's about the things that might have come intergenerationally to you that you are now responsible, because every action, thought, feeling, decision, you pass on to your grandbabies, and their generations, grandbabies, and it keeps on going on. So we can choose if we're going to pass on all goodness, or are we going to pass on the dragons? Are we going to pass on the hurts? Are we going to pass on the lessons to learn?
Thank you very much. I think we'll take questions as they come.
Thank you. Wonderful. Fascinating. I'm going to, the first question that came in, and I'm going to put to the panelists, to the chat right now. Someone asked, is that taxonomy of dragons available online? And indeed it is. In fact, it's online at the futureecologies.net/dragons podcast website. So I've added that link to the chat, and I'll put it in the speaker series webpage as well, along with some of the other, I found a couple other links about the Dragons of Inaction work, which is fascinating. And the next question in a broad stroke was one about the images that you're using for your title slides. Yeah. What are those of?
We found some artwork on a wonderful site called, oh God, what is it called? Unsplash, which is a Creative Commons Zero public domain photography website, which is very useful. And it's an artist who makes these images of splattered paint. It was one of the artwork for the whole series is this dragon's eye. It looks a little bit like the earth. And the splattered paint was originally kind of a dragon skin motif, and we just carried that through for every episode artwork.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Definitely, yeah. Scale reptilian.
Yeah.
Any idea of the size limitations that would be associated with place attachment? Specifically, is something like the Salish Sea too large of an area for people to feel that sense of attachment?
I mean, in the episode, we Adam brought in this concept of America as a place, so I think maybe I'll let him speak to that. I don't think the Salish Sea is too small or too large to consider an attachment to place, but Adam,
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah.
No, yeah. I mean, the Salish Sea, I think, is actually the formulation of the Salish Sea. Even it's an incredible concept, that has arisen in the relatively recent history, and I think gives us all something to organize and talk about.
Yeah. Cascadia to the same extent. I think any place that we can name is a place that we can be attached to.
Yeah, the power of the name.
Yeah,
which is definitely part of the Salish Sea naming process. That goal there,
and part of the dragons themselves, right? Like this idea that once we name something, we make it real in our minds, and then we can deal with it.
Sure.
Yeah.
So from someone who's been listening to your podcast asks, in the Jellyfishing for Answers episode, you describe one of the numerous problems plaguing the ocean, jellyfish blooms. How would you frame problems like jellyfish blooms, resource management, invasive species in the context of working with children, specifically teaching youth, and more specifically in a situation where you're working with children who would rather be throwing and playing with the jellyfish than actually learning in a deep ecology kind of way. Any thoughts?
We're not usually talking about psychology. We're usually talking about something like jellyfish. We spent actually an awful long time talking about jellyfish. Lately, we're talking a lot about seaweed. So yeah, those are our typical topics. In terms of children, it's definitely a podcast focused for an adult audience. So I'll defer to people who work with children in terms of how best to communicate with children. But I know that Mendel had some thoughts on jellyfish specifically.
Yeah, I think the timing for this question is really apt because we just put out an episode specifically on invasive species, and I think it has a lot of really interesting thoughts in terms of how we conceptualize and relate to these different species, which we might think of as problematic. And one of the top lines from that episode is this idea that all species, all beings deserve respect in some form. So I guess that would be my first stop in talking to kids. I don't think it's respectful to throw jellyfish, and also some of them are harmful, can be dangerous. So I think it's an important lesson to get in. And the other thing that came out of that episode is also this idea that we can't necessarily really blame those species for the position that they're in because of human actions, because of anthropogenic climate change or habitat loss or introductions around the world. In many cases, we are behind those situations for jellyfish blooms. And also, if you are interested in dealing with jellyfish blooms, harvesting jellyfish or throwing them at your friends is not really the way to solve that problem. It's you have to address ocean warming and these trophic changes. You have to address marine development and habitat, and there's much lower level causes of what's behind those jellyfish blooms rather than just treating the symptom, which is jellyfish everywhere. So that may not necessarily be stuff that you would be communicating to a bunch of kids, but I think it's important to think about when we think about blame and respect in these interspecies dynamics.
Yeah, excellent. Question, how has the learning from scales of change spread into your broader work of future ecologies in terms of that project, bright spots or place attachment, those things? Are you finding those feeding into the other podcasts?
I mean, I think part of our goal, and Adam, feel free to jump in whenever, but from the get-go with this series, we really loathe the idea of ending an episode on a downer. It sucks to listen to and just to feel like like, well, that's it, right? What hope do we have? The jellyfish episode itself was one where it was kind of like, oh, like this might just be the situation, and we have to, you know, we can maybe resolve ourselves to that, and those jellyfish are still worthy of our I'm getting still fixated on
Respect,
jellyfish.
admiration, love.
Yeah. but overall, this idea of solutions-based kind of storytelling, I think, was something that really stuck with us and was present from the beginning. But how did it change us, Adam? Are we different now?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think we've been trying to do that in our work all along. That was part of our thesis. We just finished a series on kelp and on kelp deforestation up and down the a really unique project up on Haida that is working to restore kelp.
Your internet's a little flaky, Adam.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Kelp worlds.
Yeah.
And then following on that, a question of how do you balance between bright spots, focusing on the positive, versus not glossing over valid concerns and threats?
I mean, I think the lessons of bright spots is not just distracting yourself with those things that are positive, but it's identifying those tools that you have available to learn from. You say what's working over here, where like Ellen gives the example of coral reefs that are surviving despite acidification and rising temperatures, and saying like, well, what's special about these corals? How can we apply those lessons in the places where corals are under threat? Places where societies are thriving despite certain oppressive conditions, right? It's not just saying like, hey, look at this is a good news story. It's about actually taking those things and moving those tools to where they could be applied better. Yeah, and that's Hope Funk, right? That's using every tool at your disposal. Yeah, I hope that answered the question. Is Adam still here even? Is he
I'm still here. I just turned my video off because I'm really flaking out.
Okay. Oh, Stefan, you're muted.
Stefan, you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, so we can hear Adam, but we can see Stefan. On the topic of bright spots, a quick shameless plug. Ellen Kelsey did a talk for us a couple years ago, and I'll post that link into the Huxley webpage as well. Question of how do you manage personal stress about climate change, considering its probability, inevitability, on your mind and in conversation? You know, it's in the news all the time. How do you contain that? How do you take that?
Adam, you want to go first?
I mean, I think that you know, again, coming back, I know we're coming back to Ellen Kelsey's work again, but that idea of bright spots is very helpful to me, and just actually, like, I know it's stressful to be talking about this all the time, but if we're talking about this from a solutions focused perspective, we all know that these are huge issues. Media in general has done an incredible job of communicating environmental problems to us. It hasn't done such a great job of communicating the ways that we can address these issues creatively or collectively. And so the more that we can share those stories with one another, I think that, like, for me, it makes me a lot less stressed out personally. You know, I'm at therapy. There's also something good to be said for therapy. I mean, it's a crazy time that we're living through. This is, I think, unprecedented in human history. The challenges that we face and the degree to which we are informed about them and are also, you know, only so efficacious in our ability to address them individually. There's never been anything like it, I don't think. So yeah, we just got to take care of one another, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, we were midway through releasing the series and practically finished. Well, no, actually, no, that's not quite right. We basically had to adapt the whole series when the pandemic started happening, and we really turned around in the middle of it to kind of reflect on what we were going through when we hadn't really prepped the material for that. Obviously, we couldn't predict it. And I mean, the truth of it may or may not have played out in your opinion, but it seemed to us, at least where we were, that there were these sweeping social changes that could come across quite rapidly. And that gave me
yeah,
a lot of hope.
I remember initially just being pissed off. It's like for years and years and years, we don't have enough money or we can't do things about climate change. And then suddenly there's a pandemic and suddenly we're able to change and transform our entire lives. And of course, it felt like that in the first few months when we were making the series. And then of course, the last year has happened and there's been the backlash to all the changes and then misinformation. And then of course, even with the incredible resources that have been put into trying to solve and manage this crisis, there's still been a great deal of loss, and we've all had to, it's touched many of us in that sense. So yeah, I don't know, the parallels between climate change and COVID are numerous, and have been made, I think, well in many contexts.
I want to add to that and say that one thing that we didn't even talk about during this session, but was an important part of chapter 3, was this idea of grief and coming to terms with the fact that not everything is going to be gravy on the other side of this thing, right? Like we are going to experience loss. We are going to see familiar things disappear, and that it is a grieving process and one that is better managed with a freedom to talk about and be open about with our communities, that we actually need to process that together, and that we it'll just be that much more traumatic if we try to just pretend that it's okay, or that we're fine with everything that's happened so far. Like, grief will be part of it. And
absolutely. The follow-up question, nicely out of that, do you think there are benefits to using a podcast as opposed to other as your platform, both for dealing with climate change, but also for obviously dealing with pandemic?
Podcasts
podcasting is incredible. And you can go in depth, it's hard to get people to read an article that's a few pages long these days, but people will listen if you produce a podcast well. If it has good production value, or if it speaks to them, they'll listen for hours. We've gotten an answer from a lot of listeners. We asked, do we go too in depth? Like, because sometimes our episodes are usually an hour long. They're really detailed. We go into a lot of the science. We talk to a lot of people. We get really in the weeds, and a lot of our listeners have been like, there's no dive that's too deep, just keep doing it. Just keep going deeper. And I think there's just, the podcast is an amazing form of media for that in a time when I think, people just kind of read headlines and take their cues from there. I mean, to have a medium where people can really zone in on these kinds of stories and really get into the weeds, which is where we really need to be. A lot of these issues are incredibly complicated and challenging. The other advantage is that a lot of our audience lives and works largely outside, out of doors. And for somebody like me, I live on a small island and work outside all the time. Podcasts are how I stay connected to the rest of the world. And there are a lot of listeners like that as well.
Are there changes that you have made in your lives personally that you attribute to the work you've been doing, helpful tools, etc.?
I'm not entirely sure how to answer that. I don't have a specific helpful tool. Well, actually, maybe one thing, another kind of piece of rhetoric from Dr. Gifford, Robert, and something that played into this whole series was these different ways that people can be motivated to overcome dragons. And he refers to them both affectionately, but some people, he says, are mules, who are people who do climate positive things because they want to, because they love their environment, because they know it's the right thing to do, and they will suffer some personal hardships just to get the satisfaction of knowing that they're doing the right thing. And they bear that climate brunt for the rest of us. Under that idea of the mule, they're carrying the load. And then the other is the honeybee, which is this idea that there's this person who's doing a good thing, but they're doing it incidentally because they have some other incentive to motivate them to do that thing. And it just so happens to be climate positive. And that if you can just spin the positive behavior towards, hey, driving an electric car is actually really fun. It accelerates really well. You'll save a lot of money on gas, like all these things. It doesn't matter that they're not burning fossil fuels. The EV thing is Robert's favorite example for climate behaviors. So for me, looking for, I guess, ways that I can do that internally as well, because there's lots of ways that I know that I could be doing more climate positive things in my own life, and it's like, oh well, how do I tell myself this internally? Like, how can I motivate myself to do this thing when I don't necessarily feel like being a mule for the sake of it, right? I want some creature comfort, but how can I, get past that? Adam, do you have other tools for growth?
I mean, I feel like I've been living, the stress on my mind has just been like trying to do everything that I can. I bike to work. We invested in an electric vehicle. We're trying to grow as much of our own food as we can on this little island, and trying to transition our house and do everything that we can. And I feel like in some ways this series was just a way of being like, what else can we try? Like, let's do this work locally, and let's also talk to people and try to broadcast this out. I hope that like people also just hear that other people are working on these issues, and that they're working alongside other people, even if they can't see them or throw a rock and hit them in the next field. And so I hope that it takes a little bit of the anxiety, right? The weight off of your shoulders. It certainly takes the weight off of mine to talk to these folks who are doing this work, and to know that there are people out there listening and also caring about this kind of stuff. So, it's a load that we have to bear together.
And perhaps a final question, does the dragon paradigm have a viewpoint about how people can work together collaboratively to address climate change, planting trees, practicing regenerative agriculture? What's the vision for how one uses that diagram?
Yeah, I would. So there's a whole genus of dragons that has to do with social comparison. I think I have that right. And then within that, there is social comparison itself as the type species of this genus, and then social norms, and there's a couple others. But where we went with that episode was this idea that if we can use those ideas of social norms and values and this comparison to spur these beneficial actions. So if part of your community is doing these things, and you can make that seem more normal, more acceptable, then that is how you can kind of engender those types of behaviors, I think. There isn't a more specific collaboration dragon, as far as I know, or anything to do with regenerative agriculture or planting trees in specific. But yeah, I think it's normalizing these climate behaviors.
And I can speak to that just for a minute, which is that I think that is one of the limitations of the dragons, that they, and that's why we really tried to, in the series, focus every opportunity to bring out opportunities for structural or collective change, or to even challenge the dragons in certain circumstances, because psychology is about us as individuals, largely. There is kind of community level psychology and national level psychosis, as we've witnessed. But it's about us as individuals in many ways. And that's important, but it's not the whole story. So I think that you can use the dragons. I think they're especially useful in looking at the media when people are criticizing certain solutions to climate change for reasons that are maybe not fully thought through. Like, you can identify dragons all around you in the arguments that people are making for or against various solutions. And I find it extremely helpful to have just gone through the process of like looking at all these dragons and saying, oh yeah, I've seen that. I've seen people, I've seen people make that argument. I've seen people make that argument. I've made that an argument inside of my own head, and to have that rubric is really helpful. But yeah, it definitely doesn't solve our challenges for us. It's just one way of looking at this incredibly complex issue.
I didn't check, but is there a non-Latin translation of the?
Yeah, so, and this confuses a bunch of people on the website. It's my fault, but there's a list of all the dragons within their genera on the website, but you have to click on them and then it'll expand the details. So you go from genus to species to like description, essentially. So, yeah.
My Latin is rusty.
Yeah, it's all made up. Yeah.
Adam, Mendel, thank you very much. It's wonderful to put a face to a voice from the podcast universe out there. At least we had a face of Adam for most of it. And so thank you for your time. I want a quick plug. Next week, our guest will be journalist Mike Sato, who will be talking about Read All About It. What's the news on the Salish Sea? So a slightly different spin, printed media rather than a podcast. And again, good day, and thank you to both of you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Thanks so much for having us, and thanks for listening, sticking around.
Yeah. Okay.
Keep up the good work.
Thanks. Take care.